Thank you, thank you. Nice to be part of all these other simchas that you are celebrating and to get to know your community a little bit through this prism of being with the Board of Rabbis for a day. I want to begin with a little bit more of a response to Laura Geller's question that was then reinforced by my longtime student Cheryl Lewart after the morning session. Let me say it this way. Where are you? Laura and Cheryl, are you here? Okay, good. So I can say it this way. I like to answer it liturgically. We have two brachot that come in a row in Shachrit. We say Yotzer Or, and then we say Ahava Rabbah. I like to say God doesn't do anything different between Yotzer Or and Ahava Rabbah. God sends the light. The trees make chlorophyll out of it. We make love out of it. It's the same light. It's the same light. Now for us, because we are humans, we like to say that love is part of an eternal love. That love is part of, there's only one love. The Baal Shem Tov and Sigmund Freud completely agree. There is only one love. All eros is contiguous with all other eros, except Freud calls it the libido, and the Baal Shem Tov calls it the love of God. It depends from which end you begin. Do you say it's down here and gets sublimated, or do you say it's up there and flows downward? But it's all the same contiguous one love. That's enough. The Torah describes two holidays. We just read in Parshat Re'eh a long list of holidays, but they're only mentioned very briefly. There are two holidays the Torah spends length of time describing: Pesach and Yom Kippurim. Pesach is described very thoroughly in Sefer Shemot, of course. It's a holiday for the whole Jewish people. Everybody has to do Pesach. Yom Kippurim, Yom Kippur, is described very carefully by the Torah in Parshat Acharemot, as we will read on Yom Kippur. It's entirely a holiday for the priest. It's all about the day when the priest goes into the Holy of Holies and performs the rite to purify the sanctuary and then purify the camp of Israel so that they and the world go on for another year. The people have very little to do with it. There's only one thing it says about the rest of us who are not Kohen Gadol that particular year. It says, V'initem et nafshotechem. V'initem et nafshotechem. You shall afflict your souls, it's usually translated. From that, of course, we get the Chamisha Inuyim, the 5 forms of affliction in Yom Kippur, and so forth. That word v'initem, it's a rare root. It's related to ani, to poor, and to anav, humble. Although BDB doesn't say so, I like to connect it also to the root ayin nun hey, which means to answer, to respond. V'initem ad nafshotechem, at least in my Midrash, is an intensification. V'initem instead of v'anitem. V'initem is an intensification. Make yourselves responsive. Become present, become responsive to that which is. That's what the inui of Yom Kippur is, the whole purpose of all those inuyim. Not eating, not drinking, sexual abstinence, all the other things are there because of the initim, to make yourselves responsive. To what are you responding? To that which Rabbi Soloveitchik in his beautiful essay calls Kol Dodi Dofek, the sound of my beloved that's knocking. God is calling to us, knocking on the door to see if we will open the doors of our hearts. That's what this month of Elul is all about. It's a knocking on the door. The daily blowing of the shofar is there to arouse us, is there to awaken us, is there to help us open the door because the lover is waiting. And so it's not accidental that Elul is read as an acronym by the rabbis for Ani Lidodi V'Dodi Li. I am my beloved and my beloved is mine. That's why it's called Chodesh Elul. The Sfas Emes comes along and says, that's very nice. It says, Ani Lidodi V'Dodi Li, but it also says, Dodi Li V'Ani Lo. So why isn't it called Chodesh Dalul? Why isn't it the other way around? Why is it Ani Lidodi first? The answer, of course, is what Yom Kippur is about, remembering what the event on the calendar that Yom Kippur commemorates. It's the second 40-day period that Moshe Rabbeinu spent on the mountaintop. He went up on Elul, was there for 40 days and 40 nights, finally came down, saw the golden calf being made, threw the tablets down. That was the first tragedy of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, exactly 40 days after Shavuot. God then calls him back up for 40 days. He goes up on Rosh Chodesh Elul and comes down on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the final day of that 40-day period. That is about a renegotiated marriage. The marriage went bad the first time. It went bad the first time, he understands, because he dictated all the terms. V'haluchot ma'aseh Elohim hema, v'hamichtav michtav Elohim charut al-haluchot. God made the luchot, and God wrote on the luchot. When that marriage went bad, he got smart and said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Psol lecha shnei luchot avarim karishonim. This time you make the luchot. You make the luchot, I'll write on them. In the end, it turns out that Moshe also does the writing on the luchot. So in other words, it becomes a different kind of marriage, more participatory, more egalitarian, more we will now make the terms together, and that marriage obviously has lasted a very long time. So on Yom Kippur, we are commemorating the reconstruction of a marriage. What happens in that moment? Both are struggling to trust. So he says to her, you take the first step. She says to him, no, you take the first step. We say to God, Hashiveinu elecha v'nashuva. And we get answered, Shuvu elai v'ashuva alechem. The Sfas Emes says, no, we have to take the first step. That's why it's ani l'dodi v'dodi li. First we have to approach God, then God to approach us. We are the ones who walked away from that marriage. We are the ones who went and worshipped other gods. Now it's time for us to engage in the act of trust first. And so Elul is ani l'dodi v'dodi li. That second 40 days on the mountaintop is the time when Moses argues with God not to destroy Israel. It is in some ways the matrix of prayer. It's where we learn most about prayer. I'm going to ask you now to pull out the page from Brachot, from the Steinsaltz edition of the second Brachot that you have in your hands. And I want to read a little bit from the Talmud about that 40 days on the mountaintop. You have it in Hebrew on one side and in English on the reverse side of the page. Try to follow in the Hebrew. וידבר השם אל משה לאמור, אל משה לך רד. My lech red, why does God tell Moses, go down from this mountain? Amar Elazar. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, God said to Moses, Moshe red migdulacha. Klum natati lecha gdula ela b'shvil Yisrael. I made you great not for your sake, you're nothing special, I did it for Israel, because I love Israel. V'achshav Yisrael chatu, now they've sinned. Ata lamali, what do I need you for? Miyad tashash kocho shel Moshe v'lo haya yechol ledaber. We rabbis should remember that, yes? We're there only because God loves Israel, because God loves the Jewish people, not because we're so great. So if the Jewish people are rejected, suddenly the rabbi couldn't open his mouth. V'chevan she'amar, but then God said to Moses, Heref mimeni v'ashmidenu. Step aside from me, leave me alone, that I may destroy them. Moses hears that, leave me alone, Heref mimeni, let go of me. Amar Moshe Davar Talui bi, wait a minute, this thing is up to me? Miyad amad v'nitchazek b'tfilah u'vikesh lachamim. He realized, I have something to say about this, I have some power. God is saying, let me go that I may destroy them. Suppose I don't let him go. That means maybe he won't be able to destroy them. So the leader has a role. The leader has a role in defending the people before God. My late teacher, who we lost this year, Yochanan Mufs, the most exciting single teacher I ever had. I think I used to walk out of his class with a headache every time from thinking so hard. Yochanan Mufs wrote a wonderful piece years ago called Tfilatan Shel Nevi'im, where he talked about the prophet as intercessor. The prophet is the one who stands up to God for the sake of Israel. The prophet and the Hasidic Rebbe, in the image of that kind of prophet, of course, Levi Yitzchak, as a kind of prophetic figure, standing up to God. The Zohar says God appointed 3 leaders over humanity. God said to Noah, I'm going to destroy humanity, go build an ark. Noah does not argue, goes and builds an ark. He's the bad leader. He's only tzaddik b'dorotav. He's only considered righteous because there was nobody better in that generation. But he was a failure as a leader. He didn't stand up for his people. God comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham says, no, you're not. Well, then what if there are 50 righteous? And then what if I'm lacking only 5 for that 50? We'll destroy it for the 5, and so on. Gets him down to 45, 40, gets him down to 10, and Abraham gets too scared to argue anymore. So over 10 people, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. God says to Moses, I'm going to destroy Israel. Moses says, if you're not going to let them live, wipe me out of your book. In other words, over my dead body, you're going to destroy Israel. You're going to have to kill me first. And that's the leader, that's the kind of leader we want. So in terms of leadership, in terms of thinking about the rabbi's role and thinking about our role in standing up with our people and standing up for our people. Amar Moshe davar ze tzelui bi. Is if it's up to me, miyad mitchazek, he got stronger in his prayer. Uvikesh rachamim. Mashal lemelech shaka'as al beno. So we have one of these lovely parables. The king got angry at his son. Vayamakeyu makah gedolah. He whacked the kid very hard. Vayavu havo yoshev lefanav. And the king's friend was sitting in front of him. Umityarelo marlo davar. Was afraid to say anything to the king because he's the king. If the king wants to whack his son, what can you say? Amar HaMelech, and then the king said, Ilmalei ohavi zeh sheyoshev lefanai harakticha. Were it not for my friend who was sitting before me, I would kill you. This friend suddenly realizes, Davar zeh telui bi. It's about me, it's up to me, I can do something. Miyad amat bihitzilo. And therefore it says, when God said to Moses, V'ata hanichali, when God says to Moses, let me alone, let me destroy them, and make you a great nation. And when they say that, you know, they're about to say something very daring. If Scripture didn't say this, I wouldn't dare say it. Although Scripture, of course, doesn't say it. Milamed shetfaso Moshe LaKadosh Baruch Hu ki adam shu toves et chavero bevigdo. He grabbed him by the shirt. He grabbed him by his capote, whatever the Rebbeinu Shalom wears. Grab like a person grabbing a person by his shirt and saying, Amar lefanav Ribono Shel Olam en ani me'anichacha ad shetimchol v'tislach lem. I am not going to let you go until you forgive them, until you make atonement for them. God tries to bribe him and says, listen, I'll make a great nation out of you. Moses says to God, Ribono Shel Olam, Ma kisei shel shalosh raglayim ino yachol lamod lefanecha bishat ka'ascha? A 3-legged stool based on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can't stand before you when you blow up? Kisei shel regel achad al achad kama v'chama. How much more a stool that's standing on only one leg? A 1-legged stool is going to stand. Finally, just skip down a little bit. No, let's read one more line. I'm ashamed before my ancestors. He saw greatness for himself and not for them. Vayachal Moshe et pnei Hashem, and so it says, Vayachal Moses supplicated before God, Melamed she'amad Moshe b'tfilah lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu ad shehechel lahu. Moses stood in prayer before God until he made him sick. Until he made him sick, hechel lahu. Or maybe, as the text goes on to say, hechel lahu, until he released him from his vow. God said, I'm going to destroy them. Moses releases him from the vow. What happens there on Sinai on that last day that makes it Yom Kippur? God gives him the second tablets, but before God gives him the second tablets, suddenly this voice comes out at the great climax of their discussion. This voice comes out, it doesn't say who says it, but a voice rings forth and says, Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum V'chanun, Erech HaPayim V'rav Chesed V'emet. God, compassionate and great, forgiving, and so on, except, and that text, of course, becomes the text of all of our atonement liturgies, becomes the text for all of our slichot. In your traditional synagogue, it's repeated over and over and over again on slichos and on Kol Nidre night, except that text is a transformed text. Because the text of the Torah says, No tzer chesed lalavim, no seyavon lefesha, v'chata v'nakeh lo yinakeh. V'nakeh lo yinakeh. Poked avon avot al banim, al shleshim v'al rebeim. God surely will not cleanse, will visit the sins of the fathers on the children after the third or fourth generation. The synagogue had the daring to take that verse and cut it off in the middle. It's one of the most passionately daring acts of Midrashic exegesis. It's called Sarsehu v'darshehu. You emasculate the text in the course of interpreting it. They took the infinitive absolute, v'nakeh, which was to emphasize lo yinakeh, v'nakeh lo yinakeh, God will cleanse. We have declared, we have taken the text and said, we know what we need that text to mean. We need that text to mean God is a God of compassion and forgiving. Never mind, Poked Avon Avot Al Shleshim V'Rabim. We'll read that when we read the Torah. But we're not going to read that in the synagogue. That was a very daring and courageous act of Midrash. Sometimes Midrashic exegesis can really be that. The text is transformed because we need God to be a God of compassion. What I mean to say is my suggestion for your Yom Kippur sermon. Your Yom Kippur sermon should be about overcoming anger, because Yom Kippur is the day of overcoming anger. It's the day when God overcomes anger, and it's the day when we too need to work on overcoming anger. Friends, there is too much anger in our society. We live in a very angry world. We live in a polarized world. We live in a polarized world both in American society and in Jewish society. Sarah Palin, the Tea Party movement, the ugly feelings around Obama. There is just a lot of unjustified anger in this society. In this case, it goes mostly from right toward left, but sometimes from left toward right as well. We are just too angry. The decibel level of our debate has become frighteningly high. In the Jewish community, even more so. We just had a session about that subject. But I want to add to that, to my footnote to that, we're all very angry. There's a deep anger in us. I'm a committed left-wing Zionist for a long time, and I'm deeply angry at the settler movement. I'm deeply angry at them. I believe they are destroying the state, and I'm deeply angry at them over it. Too much so, more angry than I should be. They're angry at me too. I'm an Oslo traitor, I know. I live on the other side of the Great Divide. I know the rhetoric is terrible in both directions. I intentionally say it that way, to talk about, to bring out before us the fact that we have an awful lot of anger, and I feel partisan to that, but I feel it's wrong, and I feel I have to overcome it, and I have to work on it. We all have to work on it to affect that decibel level. This is a time of working to overcome anger, and working to say there is too much anger in our general society, in our Jewish community, in our personal lives as well. Jews believe, Jewish Musar traditions believe, that Ka'as is a midara'ah. Anger is a bad attribute. It's not something you should be proud of. It's not something you should develop. In that sense, I think Jewish ethical literature goes against what's very prevalent in our sort of post-Esalen American ethos. Let it all hang out. Express it. It's good for you. Jewish Musar generally doesn't teach that. Anger is something to be overcome, not to be given free expression of. Remember, we have no Shabbos unless there's an overcoming of anger. The genius of the rabbis in Tzfat, who took Psalm 95 and stood it up as an entrance liturgy into Shabbos. 40 shana akut bedor va'omar am to'e levavem vehem lo yadu derachai asher nishbati be'api im yevu'un el menuchati. I swore in my anger, for 40 years I was so angry at those Jews in the wilderness, I swore in my anger they would not come into my land. Of course, menuchati there means el ha-menucha vel ha-nachala. Menuchati there is sacred space. It means geography. They would not come into my land. The genius of the person who took that, who saw that word menuchati, and transferred it, I'm speaking now Heshelian sacred time, sacred space language, who transformed it from sacred space you may not enter to sacred time you may not enter. Unless you overcome that anger, you may not enter into my sacred time. That insight was first shared with me by Jack Reamer many, many years ago. That's what this psalm is. This psalm is a kind of, in the classic biblical study sense, a liturgy of entrance before you walk into the temple. That's a psalm you must recite before you walk into the temple of Shabbat. And it's about God overcoming anger, but it's about our overcoming anger. We have a God who needs to overcome anger because we need to overcome anger. That's a projection of our need. The account of such a God is the account of what it means to be a human being. This morning I was talking especially about male anger and male violence. This tradition was written to a large extent by men and for men. It applies to everyone, but I think there is something in that violent, angry streak that has to be overcome. That is very much particularly part of the male baggage that we carry, that side of our psyche's baggage that we all carry. And that means learning to stop being angry, learning to come back to the possibility of being responsive to kol dodi dofek. Kol dodi dofek can't be answered unless we are not angry, unless we have been able to put aside our anger. So we can't enter into Shabbat, we can't enter into Yom Kippur, we can't enter into El HaKodesh, unless we put aside anger. You remember Unatana Tokef, Utshuva, Utfila, Utzdaka, Ma'avirin, Roa HaGzeira. If you look in your grandparents' Machzor, which was published by the Hebrew Publishing Company, or maybe in Keterkov, over it says Utshuva, Utfila, Utzdaka, Ma'avirin, Roa HaGzeira. Over Tshuva, it says Tzom. Over Tefillah, it says Kol. And over Tzedakah, it says Mamon, in three little sets of letters, usually not vocalized. Tzom, Kol, Mamon. Gematria of Tzom, 136. Gematria of Kol, 136. Gematria of Mamon, 136. All three of them are equal, Tshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah. But you add up 136 three times, and you get Zot, 408. What's Zot? Bizot yavo Aharon el HaKodesh, b'tshuva u'tefillah u'tzedakah. That's the only way you can enter into the holy place, with the gifts of tshuva u'tefillah u'tzedakah. That's the only way you can enter into Yom Kippur, with tshuva u'tefillah u'tzedakah. Now I want to share a document with you, an ancient document from our ancestors. And that is a document which you will see looks like this. On the very top of the page it says Averot ben Adam l'Chavero. This is a historic document. This was the document that we used every year for half a decade anyway to conclude Kol Nidra services at Havorat Shalom in Boston. Kol Nidra concluded this way. The Kol Nidra service, the Yom Kippur Eve service, concluded this way. We passed out this text. People sat in silence for as long as they needed to sit with this text. There was no greeting, there was no talking in the building. If you wanted to talk, you went outside. You sat there as long as you needed to, except that you could get up, walk around the room, and if there was anybody you needed to ask forgiveness of, you could do it at that moment. And the text was, it comes from the Sephardic Kriyat Shema al Hamitah, which actually is to be recited each night. Ribono shel olam, hareini mochel v'soleach, l'chol mi sheyichis v'yichnit oti. O shechata negdi, I'm sorry for the printing here, O shechata negdi, ben begufi, ben b'mamoni, ben b'chvodi, ben b'chol asher li, ben be'ones, ben b'ratzon, ben b'shogeg, ben b'mezid, ben b'davar, ben b'maaseh, ben b'gilgul zeh, ben b'gilgul acher, l'chol ben adam, v'lo ye'anesh shum adam b'sibati. Lord of the world, I stand before you, before my fellow men, pardoning, forgiving, seeking at last to be open and forgiving to all those who have hurt or angered me. Be this hurt of body or soul, of honor or property, whether the other was forced to hurt me or did so willingly. whether it was by accident or intent, whether I was hurt by word or by deed, whether this wound is a new one or one that still festers from some earlier world of mine. I forgive because we are both human. May no person bear guilt on my account. And then in L'Shem Yichud, to unite that which has been torn apart, to repair by love and awe that which is broken, I am prepared to take upon myself the commandment to love my neighbor as myself. And then we just sat in silence. And when you were ready to get up, you got up. So now I want to do something a little unorthodox. I would like you to spend 5 minutes with a chavruta. I would like you to spend 5 minutes with a chavruta in groups of 2 or 3, not more. And I would like you to ask one another, could you do some version of that in your synagogue for Kol Nidre this year? To end it with a silence, with a time for people to ask forgiveness, ben adam lechavero, and then with this kind of meditation, not necessarily with this text, but this is a suggested text. Take 5 minutes for that conversation. A chaver or two, a chavera or two, around that question, could you end Kol Nidre in something like that way? I hope this has encouraged several of you to think about doing something. That's a very, yes, David?
Hi, David Stein from Culver City.
My former student.
Yes, and I'm working with the Taoist Jewish Center in New Mexico, actually, so it's 1,000 miles away. And I could see doing this at the end of Kol Nidre night, letting people sort of disperse, because we don't have any formal dismissal then anyway. It might suit very well my telling a story about forgiveness and reconciliation just prior to that, and then leading into this. So thank you.
Good, good. Yes, I think Kol Nidre night, rather than Nila, because Kol Nidre night, you've still got Yom Kippur going. It's a very powerful moment you hopefully have created at Kol Nidre, and I'm suggesting that you use that moment. Let people use that moment for something important in their lives. Let that become a moment when people think about their relationships and their marriages, and the person in the next pew they know doesn't like them because of so and so that happened. I think this is a moment that's too valuable to just end with L'Shana Tova Tikatevu, and everybody gets in their car and goes home. So think about how you might adapt this for your own use. Now, since we are here partly on Federation auspices, I will tell you that if you go to Federation events anywhere, one of the things they will do as icebreakers to make people feel Jewish is play this game of, what's your favorite Jewish holiday? Almost nobody says Yom Kippur. And I can guarantee you no rabbis say Yom Kippur. That's for sure. It's not mine either. And I feel sorry for 3-day-a-year Jews who only experience Judaism in its Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur variety. I wish they'd come Purim, Simchas Torah, and Shavuos instead for if they want to be 3-day-a-year Jews. But that's what they have chosen, and of course they wind up with the guilt peckle they get because that's what they chose. The Yamim Noraim were saved for me like so many other things were saved for me by Chassidut. So the idea I mentioned already this morning, the Sfas Emes saying that we have Chayim written in our hearts, and on Rosh Hashanah we ask God to clean off the tablet of our hearts so we can see the Chayim that's there, we can see the inscription of life that's still there. For Yom Kippur, he says that the 2 sets of tablets, of course, differ. The first tablet said Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember the Sabbath. And the second set of tablets said, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. It's the second set of tablets that were given on Yom Kippur, and Shmirah is Balev, Zechirah is Bapeh. When we say Kiddush, we're being Zocher et Yom HaShabbat, Zecher l'Maaseh Bereshit, Zikaron l'Tziat Mitzrayim. But the Shmirah is Balev, Shmor et Yom HaShabbat, and the sense of guarding and keeping we have is within our heart. So that's given to us on Yom Kippur, and we have Katveim al Luach Libecha, you write them on the tablets of your hearts. So those second luchot, of course, are really internal, they're an outer symbol for an inward grace, as our Catholic friends like to say. The outward luchot are a symbol of the luchot. I'll come to questions in a little while. Are an outward manifestation of the real luchot which exist in our hearts. The reason we can't see the luchot in our hearts, of course, is because we don't have a lev basar, or because they're covered by an orlat halev, if that image isn't too problematic for you. Both of those mean, of course, rak avonotechem mavdilim beini uvenechem. It's only our sense of sin and sinfulness and the guilt that sin brings about that separates us from God. That's why the Baal Shem Tov was such a religious revolutionary when he taught people that the greatest trick the evil one wants to play on you is the trick of da'agat avonot. The evil one wants to trip you up by some little sin and then make you worry about it, and then make you concentrate on it. And the more you worry about it, the farther you'll feel from God, and won't be able to be close to God, and won't be able to love God, won't be able to pray. Therefore, he said, Charata balev, immediately decide you won't do that sin again, and then go back to serving God b'simcha, because that's the only way you're ever going to come close. So those avonot mavdilim, we have a lot of those avonot mavdilim. To my mind, the biggest avonot mavdilim we have are the pace at which we live, the fast-paced world we're becoming accustomed to. My friends, we are living through one of the great transformative ages of the speeding up of consciousness. And there will be a big price to pay for that speeding up. And we rabbis, as moral and spiritual leaders, have to say something about that speeding up. It's why I believe Shabbos is more important now than it's ever been in human history. We are not slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, we're slaves to that screen in front of us. And the idea that we can turn it off once a week for 24 or 25 hours will soon be a revolutionary idea. And it's very important for us to keep that, to keep faith with it. That there still is a life that's face to face with people across the table, and not each of us in a bank of computers facing our individual screen. Watch your kid playing computer games sometime and see how fast that little thing he's chasing or she's chasing goes across the screen. And think about what it will mean to consciousness to live with something running that fast across as we go on and on into future generations. It's a very important moment we're living through, and we have to be aware of taking a stand about it. Of course we have to live with it. Of course we can't get everybody to leave the computer society. We can't leave it ourselves. But that we notice, and that we have values that stand mimul, opposite it, and especially around Shabbat, that we have something to say about it, is very important. We live in a society, I believe, that's too highly competitive, that's destructively competitive, too much corner cutting, too much sense of the corporate value system. Supposedly corporations are just there to make money, that's all they have to do. The only thing they owe society is to their stockholders to make as much as they can for them as they possibly can. And what about responsibility to societal values and humanity and decency and everything else? We've seen it on a big scale around BP this summer, but that's only a tiny, tiny fragment of what's happening to us because of a runaway corporate culture that denies moral responsibility. That corporate culture can now contribute freely and without restriction to political campaigns is also, I believe, a very serious turning point in our society's value system. I think we live in a society and a Jewish community that suffers from a terrible addiction. And addiction is something I know we're all very concerned with. I'm not talking here about food or booze or gambling. I'm talking about our addiction to success and high achievement. I believe we're a Jewish community that's over-addicted to success. We worry too much about getting our kids into Ivy League schools and getting into top jobs and getting into top med schools and top this and top that. We tend to reward those kids who are A+ students in the best schools and not have much room to reward those kids who are C students or B- students but decent kids with good values who take care of their grandparents or take care of their younger siblings or whatever it is, or live in poor families. It's those Jewish kids, by the way, who are most readily picked up by missionaries of all sorts, including Jewish and non-Jewish varieties, because in our liberal Jewish community, there was not much place for kids like that to get stroked, because we are too busy being addicted to success and being addicted to high achievement. So I think these are some of the sins we have to worry about this Yom Kippur, and some of the sins we have to remind people of. And when we think about what we have to overcome, put all those things on the table, if you will. Finally, a couple of wind-up remarks about Ne'ilah. I'll just tell you the Kitzur Nimrat very briefly about 2 Ne'ilah sermons I preached. I'll just give you the headline and you can rewrite the sermon for yourself. The first one, of course, was about what is closing. What do you mean the gates of the temple are closing? What do you mean the gates of heaven are closing? First of all, if it's the time historically when the gates of the temple would close at night in ancient times, who cares? What's the difference? And if you say the gates of heaven are closing, what do you mean? The gates of tears are never closed. It says, the Talmud says very clearly. So all I have to do is shed a tear or two, and then the gates will open again. So what does it mean, Ne'ilah, the time the gates are closing? It means, of course, the time when our gates are closing. It means when we are getting ready to close up. We have been charged to live with greater vulnerability for 40 days. We're supposed to be examining ourselves and looking deeply at who we are. It's very hard to live that way because all that vulnerability hurts. All that vulnerability requires risk. You're going to live that way all year, you're going to live that way all the time, you can't. So we sense the end coming and we begin to shut down. We begin to say, all right, what I did this Yamim Norim, I can't do more than that. That's why we say, P'tach lanu sha'ar be'et nilat sha'ar. Open the gates for us when the gates are closing. Let us keep them open a little bit longer, etc., etc. You know that sermon. The second sermon I said, maybe Ne'ilah means something different. Maybe it means, remember the 5 inuyim, the 5 restrictions of Yom Kippur? One of them is Ne'ilat HaSandal, is wearing shoes. Maybe Ne'ilah means time to put your shoes on. Ne'ilat HaSandal maybe means Yisur Ne'ilat HaSandal is over. Ne'ilah, time to put those shoes on and start walking. For these 40 days we've been talking the talk. Now it's time to start walking the walk. And the idea that these 4 days between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, of course, are a time when you're supposed to be osek b'mitzvah. And you go right after Kol Nidra in traditional societies to go start putting your sukkah, right after Ne'ilah, after you have a bait, you go start putting your sukkah up. The idea is that it's time to start walking. And then you ask, of course, what directions we should walk and what walking means, and how an angel is an omed, but a ben adam is a mehalech, because we're always walking and Jacob's ladder and all the other things we do for walking. So those are a couple of Ne'ilah themes that I've used over the years and I thought might tickle some imagination for you and see what you can do with them. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun to do this. Mark says we still have a few minutes for questions. 5 minutes left for questions. Great. Here we go. Questions and dialogue, please. Yes, please. It's up to me. Well, that's not being a bystander, of course. That's not being a bystander.
Yeah, just have an idea of what we can do with that. Just even before we've taken action, just our presence, what it does, and
Yes.
how we just walk in the world before we think of taking dramatic action, what our presence does in this world.
Good, good. In another one of these texts, and it's really shot right there in the Torah, Moshe says, "What will the nations say? What will happen to your reputation as a God if you simply destroy them there in the wilderness? They will say you weren't able to take them into the land." Well, that too. The nations will be witnesses in a way that somehow forces God's hand. Yep. I think we exhausted them. We should go on.